been married to Carolyn now for 5 years, and we now have a daughter, Katie. Currently I'm a response police officer. Drugs, road crashes, everything you hear in the news is what I deal with on a day-to-day basis. We always spoke about having a big family and wanting more kids. Deep down I always wanted a son, play football and have our own father-son moments. It wasn't until the 20-week or 21-week scan there was a slight issue, they said, and they wanted a second opinion on it. And that it looked that there was something up with the lungs. You go from being so excited and so happy to just a bit lost. They thought it was some sort of genetic issue that the baby had. And that's when they asked myself and Carolyn if we'd be happy to do tests. We then got a call from the original specialist team to say that she'd heard back from the team in Dundee and that neither myself nor Carolyn had a genetic issue. A couple of days later we had a meeting with the Queen Elizabeth team this time. They basically told us that the DNA test that they can do only covers about 20% of all the genetic issues there are, leaving 80% either unknown or they don't know how to do the test for yet. So it went from a complete high on the Saturday thinking it's not this to basically being put back saying actually it probably is. My coping mechanism, I didn't have one at all. It was a long drive from where we stayed to where I work. It didn't matter what shift I was on really, I'd be crying the way there. And then when I finished work, I'd get involved in stuff just so you didn't have a second to think. I'd cry pretty much all the way from work to home, come in, pretend that nothing was bothering me, try to deal with it yourself is quite tough. I suppose you always try to be an optimist and find the positive. If it was what they thought it was that the baby had, there was a 10% chance that the baby would survive. About a month after that, and get the phone call from Carolyn's grandfather, and he said I've stopped praying for a miracle. Which at the time I was a bit like, why? And then his next line was the bit that got me. He says, I've just started praying that you accept it. It was a bit of a shock. One night when I was at work and I got a phone call. Carolyn had phoned and said that she thought she was going into labour. Eventually when Jacob was born, he came out and he let out a big scream. And I remember my mind going, right, that's another tick in the box, that's us. Something else, that's another hurdle. He looked fine, it just looked normal, same as it did with Katie. And then they brought him over to us when he was in his incubator and said, right, we're taking him upstairs. Sitting thinking, well, they're taking him upstairs, that's another tick in the box, that's another, milestone sorted. 5 or 6 in the morning, I think I eventually crashed, got about an hour's kip, and then that's when the consultant came down. I knew what the outcome was going to be. At 5 o'clock that day, I think all the grandparents had made it down and had seen him. The nurse that was looking after him asked us if we wanted, a cuddle, some time. The nurse came in, along with the consultant who'd taken over the doctor, and was saying that his vital signs hadn't improved, and they said that we'd have to make a decision at some point with what was going to happen. But basically asked the family to leave. Me and Carolyn would just stay in that with us. When everybody left, we spoke to the nurse, the doctor, and just said, yeah, we're happy to have, I suppose, his life support switched off. That was it. He took out all the wires, all his breathing tube as well, and then we got to hold him. That was pretty much, toughest thing I've ever done. So, that was about us. myself and Carolyn have been quite open about it. You know, we don't hide it. You know, so I think that helps you heal from it a little bit. If you don't talk about something, I think it eats away at you, and then it comes back even worse than it was before. Whereas I think if you talk about it and share, you know, what's going on, no matter what type of job you do, you know, you'd be amazed at who's went through the same thing, or somebody who's got a similar experience. It's good to share. And that sounds so cliche, but it is.
Andy lost Jacob after birth. There's a lot of people who lose a little one much earlier than that. Often people can feel guilty grieving the loss of a little one so early on, and that's sometimes reinforced by other people and by friends and perhaps older folks sometimes, saying, well, they never took a breath, or they never had a heartbeat even, perhaps, or they didn't know the gender of the little one, and things like that can try to inhibit the grief and make you feel guilty grieving. And I think that's inappropriate. That's not accurate. There's no doubt from a Christian perspective and from a biblical perspective, and what we read in Psalm 139 about God moulding a little one in the mother's womb, that right from the very start there's a life there, and therefore when that life is lost, there's a life lost, no matter how early it is. And so it's not appropriate, I think, to suppress that grief, and I think there should be no feelings of guilt around grieving the loss even of a very early pregnancy. Grieving a loss is a perfectly natural thing to do, but there is a taboo around grief and around loss. And our society, I think, doesn't encourage us to grieve. If anything, it maybe encourages us not to grieve a loss. And for example, that's evident when often today, when somebody dies, there's a Thanksgiving service. And a Thanksgiving service, don't get me wrong, is entirely appropriate for the life that was lived, as long as it doesn't minimalize grieving and grieving that loss. Some people would call that a false bridge, actually, where we jump from a loss, and maybe the loss in terms of a miscarriage or a stillbirth, we jump from that to new beginnings and to what the future holds, and to new life maybe, or the potential for new life in the future. And that's not a helpful thing. The funeral service is there to grieve the loss. And when we think of Jesus and consider him from a Christian point of view, Jesus was the perfect bloke, yet grieved, and grieving was part of his experience of loss. He grieved the loss of his father when he was on the cross. He grieved the loss of Lazarus, even though he knew the new beginning that was about to happen for Lazarus. And often women, I think, will have maybe more of an emotional language or vocabulary to be able to talk about loss, where blokes perhaps don't. But we must recognize, I think, that grieving a loss is really important. Women will often grieve more perhaps than men, and Andy mentioned in his what he said about a coping mechanism, and maybe not so much having a coping mechanism. Crying, almost crying, I think he said, when he was on his own driving home from work, keeping busy at work to keep his mind off things. And that's often what guys will do. I work in the prison, and I meet men who are grieving in prison because everything else has stopped. They're in prison, their normal humdrum life has stopped, and they have time to think, and that grieving begins. And it can be grieving for a loss that was many years beforehand, and yet this is the first time they've worked through it a little bit, thought about it, were sad about it, even cried about it. And that's a healthy thing. Grieving is a healthy part of dealing with a loss and coping with a loss. It is a coping mechanism, grieving. And also something Andy said about the loss of Jacob, and Jacob affecting them for the rest of their lives. And that's very true with a loss, I think, where it isn't a matter of getting over that loss, or that loss no longer having an impact. That's not a goal to be reached, but actually grieving that loss, and the grief will change and morph and shape as time passes. but that impact and that loss will always be part of them, and grieving that loss will be an ongoing, lifelong occurrence. When we lose an adult, if we lose a relative or even a granny, if we've lost a gran in our lives, that there isn't a clear end to the grieving process for her, but actually that would impact us right through the rest of our lives as we remember that adult or that family member that we love. And I think it's the same with a little one, the loss of a little one. It's a process that will continue to affect life, and not necessarily in a bad way. My wife and I lost Karis, our little girl who was stillborn at 21 weeks. Karis herself, and the process of grieving for Karis, is still very much part of our lives and will continue to be part of our lives. So I think it's important to recognise that there's a process to grieving, and not a stage of grieving and then a finite end. One of the things that was a great help to us going through our loss, and I know a great help to Andy through his loss, was his faith. And in fact, God was a great help. The things that we often remember about God when we think of him, like his sovereignty and his goodness, those are things that perhaps we would think in light or in the shadow of a miscarriage or losing a little one, that we would question. And we would question God's sovereignty, his control over things, as in how could he let this happen? Or we would question his goodness and think, well, God can't be good in this. And our experience, certainly going through that loss, was the opposite. We didn't question those at all. And in fact, they were more real to us in many ways. God's sovereignty was very real to us, his control over the situation. And his goodness was very real to us. And in fact, were two almost anchors going through that loss. So it is really important as Christian folk that we don't doubt those things, and that we don't question those things when we're on the periphery and trying to help people perhaps going through a loss, thinking that they'll naturally be doubting God's sovereignty and God's goodness, when in fact often I think those are the anchors that can keep them going through difficult and dark times. Another thing that helped us in our loss, and I know helped Andy in his loss as well, were other people, helping friends, if you like. And Andy mentioned it's good to share, which is a total cliche, but nonetheless true. And we were helped greatly by people who would even mention Karis's name and weren't simply attempting to avoid us and not speak to us. And I can understand why people would avoid us. It's awkward and it's difficult to know what to say. And there is a section on Under the Rainbow on that web-based resource for friends trying to help and be helpful, with suggestions on it and things to say and maybe things to avoid. But certainly friends were very helpful to us. And the most helpful thing that stands out in my mind these years later was actually our minister at the time. Immediately after we had lost, Karis came along to our door and visited with us, and I can distinctly remember him arriving at the door, and we opened the door and he came in and he sat down and he didn't say a word, literally nothing. And that might sound awkward. At the time it wasn't awkward at all. And he simply sat there and he simply grieved with us and wept with us and maybe said goodbye. I can't remember. There was maybe a sentence. He stayed for about 20 minutes, half an hour. And that stands out as one of the most helpful things to us, that somebody else was there with us and sad with us. And it reminds me of in our Bibles of Job and Job's comforters. After Job has lost what he's lost and lost his family, his comforters come, and scripture tells us that his comforters were silent for 7 days in mourning with him. And that's very significant, I think. And in fact, everything starts to go wrong and pear-shaped when they start speaking in Job, if you know the story. But that period, they should have stayed silent, but that period of silence, even just being with somebody, was a great help to us. Another thing I think that's very pertinent between couples is communication. and how couples communicate. And Andy mentioned that, and mentioned not wanting to be a burden to his spouse, and often our spouses perhaps can be more emotional, or seem more emotional than us blokes. And we don't want to upset them or make that worse, and we think that's a bad thing. And my experience is actually the opposite. When I've shared with Judith about times I'm struggling or having a hard time, or grieving, or remembering our loss in particular, that's a great help to Judith. That is not a hindrance to her. That's a help to her. That's a blessing to her. So it is important that we kind of, it's obvious, but that we open up and we communicate about when times are tough, because actually that's a blessing and an encouragement in their tough times often as well, I think. Under the Rainbow is a web-based resource. It's a ministry of Rutherford Centre for Reformed Theology, and it endeavours to help people to think biblically, to think in line with God, I guess, about miscarriage and about infant loss and about infertility, and little bits of adoption in there as well. And you can find that at www.undertherainbow.org.uk.